Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing consoles as a whole. And more specifically, I just want to illustrate very much in this video that power, and by power I mean of course just how fast a console is and so on, isn't necessarily an indicator of how well the console is going to do in the marketplace. I've mentioned this in a couple of other videos, but I really wanted to dedicate a video on this and my thoughts and opinions, and of course I welcome your own and comments and so on. So, right now, everyone's really focused on the PS4 and Xbox and which of them is going to be the better system, and I use quotations there in terms of their performance numbers and, you know, the amount of flops they can do, what's going to have better anti-aliasing and so on and so forth and so forth. But I think it's really worth noting prior history, and I don't just mean about the Xbox and, say, the PlayStation and so forth. Let's even go back a little bit. Let's go back into some earlier gaming. I'm sure many of you are going to be familiar with the handheld known as the Game Boy. Now, the original Game Boy, of course, was basically a monochrome screen, green and, well, ugly, and, well, it was an incredibly popular handheld. Let's face it, it spawned a legacy. I can't really say it any other way than that. It really was. It was like, it was just a massive, I wouldn't even say fad, because fad makes it sound like it was transient, but it was spawned basically an incredible legacy. And of course there have been numerous Game Boys ever since, including the Game Boy Advance and the DS and the 3DS and everything else under the sun. But let's take a moment to think about the systems that the Game Boy actually went up against. Let's not talk about the Vita for a second. Instead, let's talk about, let's go with the Game Boy. Game Gear. The Game Gear, by the way, completely off topic, just for a second, it's an absolutely fantastically humorous GIF that I saw the other day. It had basically a fighting game kind of 2D affair, and you saw the Game Boy and the Game Gear facing off, and the Game Gear jumps back at the start of the round because this is round one fight, and then you see this Game Gear start powering up, and then the battery runs out, and then it falls down, and then the Game Boy wins the round. And while that may sound humorous and completely off topic, in reality it actually was kind of accurate. The Game Gear was significantly more powerful than the Game Boy. I'm not going to bother to go too much into specifications of ridiculously old machines, but it's fairly safe to say that, you know, this is known, and indeed the Game Gear could even do some really cool stuff like have TV tuners and various other bits and bobs installed, and I believe it was actually a derivative of the Master System. So it's a pretty damn cool and powerful system. But the reality of the matter is all this power, as I've mentioned numerous times, had a side effect, and that side effect in this case was the fact that batteries would get absolutely eaten alive. And I'm pretty sure that if you went in a car trip with your parents, I'm assuming, you know, many of you would have been really young at the time, then you probably would have had to have taken a suitcase worth of batteries, because that's how quickly the machine would gobble through them. On the other hand, the Game Boy was significantly more meaty, in that not only would it take less batteries, but those batteries would actually last a certain amount longer. I'm not exactly sure of the hours here, but I know it was certainly a significant number. The same could be said for other consoles as well, such as the Atari Lynx, which looked pretty damn sexy, looked beautiful, beautiful images and so forth, but much the same problem. The battery would just, you know, get drained. And if you actually look at various other systems along the way, for example, let's talk about the original Xbox One and the PlayStation 2. Let's not talk about the GameCube for a second, let's ignore that just for a second. No offense to Nintendo, it just makes it a hell of a lot easier to have two systems rather than talking about 3 or 4 or 5. The original Xbox was significantly faster than the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was actually quite difficult to program for, ironically enough. You really had to start using its co-processors as well. And even so, even if you were to make full use of those, the Xbox was more powerful, it had more memory and so on. And It could even output in 720p, although the PS2 too good, I think, in certain games. I'm not 100% on that, but certainly speaking, it was a very powerful machine. It even, of course, had Xbox Live, which was better than anything the PlayStation 2 had. However, if you actually take a look at the raw numbers in terms of A, the software sold, and B, the amount of systems sold, you could argue that the PlayStation 2 just ruffle-stomped it. It literally stomped it into the curb. Now, obviously, from Microsoft's perspective, the Xbox One was an extremely successful machine. It got their name out there, and now has allowed them to compete with Sony, and that's very good because Microsoft said, hey, you know what, this is what we needed to learn, and then they managed to slim down the machine. It was no longer the size of, you know, your house, and it worked really well. However, in terms of the machine, in terms of how well it's sold, the Xbox One lost out, and I love the Xbox One, incidentally. In fact, I owned that GameCube as well, and this could be said for numerous iterations of console hardware. The reality of the matter is, it doesn't necessarily mean just because you've got the best looking graphics that you are going to actually win in the war. You can even see the 3DS right now is actually dominating, and I do use that word in a very strong way. It is a strong word, but I just want to overly pronounce it, that it is actually dominating the software charts right now in Japan, and it's doing very well in hardware sales as well, despite the fact that the Wii U's getting kind of stomped on. It's not doing as well as it should be. Although I have a feeling that the Wii U is going to do significantly better when we have some really big IP. Right now, a console is only as good, well, not just right now, anytime really, a console is only good as the games released upon it. Now, the Wii U has a few small problems right now. One of them is what is known as Frostbite 3. A couple of companies, Crytek, I believe, Epic, and EA have all gone on record and said that the Wii U can't really support their engines to the fullest, and certain games just cannot work on those engines. I suppose it depends upon how much they want to cut down those games, the graphical fidelity, and various other bits and bobs to make those games work. The reality is, however, if you're talking a 25% difference, just for example, let's assume that the Xbox 720 is 25% slower than the PS4. I have no evidence of this, I'm just using it as pure example, of course. Then, the reality of the matter is, we're probably going to get a few worse ports here and there. Certainly at the start, we're probably not really going to notice anything. Of course, later on, we're going to notice the systems kind of flattening out, and then, oh, okay, then now I'm starting to notice that my system doesn't have better looking X, or maybe the game's resolutions aren't so high, or whatever. But the reality is, these games are going to look fairly reasonable on both systems. Don't believe me? Well, take a look at how difficult the PlayStation 3 is to program for. I've spoken about this quite a bit, so I'm not going to really go over it that heavily again, because I think it would be kind of monotonous. You can go ahead and check out some videos on the cell processors and so on my channel, or you can read some of my articles on redgamingtech.com if you so wish. But the reality of the matter is that, let's face it, the Xbox 360 was a hell of a lot easier to program for, just generally. And because of this, as well as the fact that the system was slightly constructed better in some areas, the Xbox 360 games just looked better. I don't really want to go into more powerful, but it certainly looked better. And so, it's not as though the Xbox 360 easily won the console war. Sure, it started to outsell the PS3 at the start, but PS3 certainly made its own back towards the end of the war, and once again, using massive quotation marks there. I think it's also worth noting that in today's age, it's not just about the graphics. We all know about the online aspects of both systems, and ignoring the always-on online stigma that's wrapped up around the Xbox, I think many people are excited to see what the online for the next generation Xbox is going to be. Apparently there's going to be improved achievement points and various other bits and pieces. And let's face it, achievements and everything else that they stood for was somewhat copied, and I use that word very loosely from Sony, by Sony, shall I say, with the trophy system. I'm not saying that they didn't have the idea originally, but I imagine some stuff was implemented when they saw just how awesome it was on the Xbox. And some people, of course, played the games early on. I don't necessarily know about now, but a lot of people were achievement whoring, and I I don't really like the term, but let's face it, that's a fairly popular term. You know, at the start, and more to the point, there were a lot of awesome additions. Now, I think right now, people are concerned with Microsoft in that they want a very good games machine. Even Peter Molyneux said that he just wants the best games machine possible. And I can understand his point of view. I kind of feel the same, if I'm honest with you. But even if you ignore all the other features that maybe you don't really give a toss about, maybe you don't care about being able to stream Netflix, maybe you don't care about being able to play Blu-ray movies, maybe you don't care about being able to access the internet on it because, you know, you just don't. Maybe you don't even really care about online gaming, maybe you just want to play single-player games or whatever. The reality is that you do want a good machine, therefore it comes down to really what you want, and more to the point, just how well you, and by you I mean those of you who buy that system support that system. And also, of course, it comes down to how well that system is marketed, how well that system is marketed to developers as well as just you. Right now, Sony are trying to solidify their relationship with developers, which is a very smart move on their part, by the way. There's another piece of news, incidentally, that Sony are scrapping the price to actually develop for their phone. I'm not sure what the price was. I think it's about $60-$70 or whatever that. But still, they've removed it. And it's only a good thing, because let's face it, it's just saying to the developers, hey, let's go onto, you know, at that platform because it's less upfront costs, and that's always a good thing. So Sony, of course, on the PlayStation Network have also done things such as adding in an indie tab, which is very good. Because obviously, if you're an indie developer, the prospect of, say, having your game appear next to God of War Ascension maybe not appeal to you. I can't really blame the indie developers for that, because obviously that's not really that fair. But having the best of indie and whatever else is a pretty nice touch. Obviously, Microsoft themselves are going to want to do that. I've already mentioned a few times about how there's rumored anyway to be the Xbox Live or Xbox Windows marketplace, where apparently it's going to be a lot easier for indie developers to be able to stick their games on there. But all of this is what makes the console popular. It's not just, I don't know, arbitrary T-flops or the amount of, you know, computing power that the game system has, or the fact that it has, I don't know, I can't think, just make you a tea in the morning. It has to be a plethora of different things which makes the console popular. And there, of course, are multiple reasons that a console may not be popular. One of them is price. I don't know if you guys were gamers back in the days of like the Neo Geo and those type of systems. The Neo Geo was ridiculously expensive, even for the time. It was $650 US, and indeed, some of the games were actually $200 each. And despite the fact that it was basically arcade quality conversions, mostly of fighting games incidentally, well, let's face it, who the hell is going to buy their kid, unless, you know, you're either extremely wealthy or very lucky, who the hell is going to buy your kid a console that costs $650 and then know that on top of that, you can't just buy them a $40 game or $30 game. You have to actually buy them ones that cost, you know, for $200. I mean, that's just absolutely insane. And of course, even the N64 had similar issues. In the UK, for example, certain games on the N64, when it was first released, cost up to 60, 70, even 80 in some cases, pounds, which is pretty damn expensive. I don't know what the US prices were. And honestly speaking, it just, you know, if you're looking at buying a new system and you see that an N64, for example, the games are retailing between, let's say, 60 to 70 pounds. Let's just use an arbitrary figure. And you see that the PlayStation games are, you know, 40, just for example. Then you say, well, gee, I'd like to look at the N64, but I could buy basically 2 games for every one of the PlayStation games. Now, obviously, one of the reasons behind this was because both of those systems were cartridge-based, and therefore cost per megabyte was extraordinarily expensive compared to, say, CD, which is one of the reasons that Neo Geo CAD came out later on, but those had their own issues as well, which I'm not really going to bother to get into in this particular video. So when you think about it, right there, they price themselves out of the market. Most people, and I'm mostly talking about the Neo Geo here, most people just do not want to spend that amount. Now, this is one of the issues that Valve are going to have, of course, when it comes to the Steam box. The Steam box is reported to be quite expensive, but then it is going to be using effectively, well, PC parts. So I think that they could kind of get away with it. Most likely, Valve are not going to be going for the same market share or even the same gamers themselves as, let's say, Sony are. So you can see right now that there are an absolute ridiculous number of factors in a console's popularity. Like it or lump it, one of the real big things, of course, is marketing. I've mentioned before, dozens of times over, that Sony are pretty good at marketing, but sometimes it's not how good you are at marketing, it's how bad you are at marketing. Sega are famous for this. Sega shot themselves in the foot several times over. In fact, they didn't even have feet because they'd shot themselves in them so many times. The Saturn was a fantastic example. The Saturn came out, not only was it bloody difficult to program for, more to the point, they basically pulled the rug out of the Genesis/Mega Drive owners' feet, because they pretty much released the system directly after, well, pretty soon after the 32X, which was a disaster, by the way. And then, so let's say you're a Genesis owner, you've bought all these games, but then Sega basically cut these off. So even if you had not been pissed off because you bought a Mega CD and a 32X, and let's say you still owned the Genesis or Mega Drive, whatever you want to call it, then your company, the one that you've been loyal to all this time, says, actually, we're not really going to be producing any more games. You should go ahead and buy our system, bro. You're not going to be that happy, are you? And then they pretty much did the same thing for the Saturn as well. They cut it off really quickly because their CEO at the time, I believe it's the American CEO, I'm not 100% on that, said that they realised that the Saturn wasn't going that well. They actually went on record pretty much and said that the Saturn wasn't doing well and they should cut their ties from it. And then basically for several months people were literally importing games. I actually got my Saturn chipped so that I could play games, and then people were just literally twiddling their thumbs wondering, should I buy a Dreamcast or should I just wait for the PlayStation 2? And I think people have been burned so many times by Sega at this point. You know, I loved them, I really was a huge Sega fan, but I just felt to myself that I just don't want to go with the risk again. You know, I love the systems, but, you know, I felt like I was in an abusive relationship here. You know, it was kind of getting ridiculous, and the reality is that this is the problem. There are so many different scenarios that can screw up your relationship with customers to the point where they just don't want to buy your systems. Now, obviously, Sega aren't, by any stretch of the imagination, the best example, because Microsoft and Sony certainly are not pissing off their customers to that incredible degree. It's not even a slight degree, it's an incredible degree. But the reality of the matter is that when you really start to boil it down, there are so many different scenarios that can win or lose you a console war. It can be the amount of games that you have on launch, it can be the price that you manage to reduce your components for, and that's another big one as well. Remember, one of the reasons that Sega weren't able to compete with the Saturn, for example, was because of how ludicrously complicated and convoluted the hardware was. Therefore, unless they wanted to sell the hardware at a fairly substantial loss, they had to keep the hardware expensive, and they could compete the same prices with Sony, at least at the start, because, well, the system was so damn expensive to actually produce. This is another reason as well. If you can start shrinking your manufacturing process, and by that I mean the die size of the CPU and the GPU and everything else, then conversely you could start to cut down on the price of the system, therefore making your system more attractive. Of course, there are a lot of other things as well. Microsoft right now are supposedly getting kind of cozy with EA, to the degree we don't know. But they seem to be getting a little bit cozier and a little bit cozier with Electronic Arts, and of course, that could be everything from DLC to exclusive games. I don't think there's going to be that many exclusives, if I'm honest. It doesn't really make sense unless, say, the Xbox really ruffle stomps over the PlayStation. Then it's slightly possible. But the reality is that it's probably not going to be that, that level. So let's face it, right now, it's still anyone's ball game, and I don't think we should focus solely on power. And I know it's really tempting to, and I know it's really fun to start comparing teraflops and everything else, but it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. It's not the only way to judge a success of a system. And I know many of you aren't getting to the point where that's what you're completely judging the system on. I just wanted to point it out. There are many reasons why you should be overly harsh on the system, and we'll see exactly what the systems are going to be really catering to. I have a feeling that Microsoft are not the only ones that's going to be revealing quite a bit over the next couple of weeks. I have a feeling that Sony are holding back quite a few announcements. It only makes sense. Why would they want to reveal everything before the competitors do? It just is ridiculous as a business decision. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I think that's just about it for this rambling video. I will hopefully see you soon. Take care and bye for now.